In this lesson, we're going to look at Web Open File Format. This is a standard developed in 2009 by Mozilla, Microsoft and Opera, and it's in the process of being standardized by the World Wide Web Consortium. The goal is to support font distribution from a web server to a browser over a network using file compression. So, before the advent of WOF, there were various different font formats, some of which were supported by one browser, another would be supported by a different browser. For example, we have EOT fonts. EOT stands for Embedded Open Type. Originally it was developed for Microsoft Internet Explorer. So what I've done is I've got 4 different versions of an Embedded Open Type font for normal text, bold, bold italic, and then just italic. So that's in the Embedded Open Type format in one folder. And then I have another folder which stores OTF fonts. OTF stands for Open Type Font. So I have the same 4 fonts, but this time in the OTF file format. And then again, I have another folder called TTF fonts. This stands for True Type fonts. And in here, I have the 4 files in TTF format. And then finally, and the purpose of this lesson is to show WOF files. So these WOF files are the standard file format going forward. So the question is, where do you get these files from? There are various different web foundries available on the internet. These are organizations that create typographic fonts, and you can either download them for free, or you can download them for a one-off cost, or you can reference them in your web page and incur a per usage fee, depending on which pricing model works best for you. So an example of a web foundry font is fontsquirrel.com. This is free, so you can go here and download fonts onto your machine. Some of these fonts are OTF. As you can see here, there's an OTF file. Other fonts use TTF format, so there's an example of a TTF. So you can download the font in one format, and there are various different converter applications available on the internet, which would allow you to convert it into a WOF file, for example. So, let me show you my web page. My web page is called mydocument.html. It contains some simple text, which is meant to be in normal, bold, italics, and bold italics. And as you can see, I've applied a font family to it using one of the fonts from a font foundry server. Let me show you what this page looks like in the editor. It's very simple. We have a style sheet that's been linked in. At the moment, we're linking in version 1 of the style sheet. And then I have some simple text, which has different classes applied to it. Normal class, bold class, italic class, and bold italic class. And I have rules set up in my style sheet that define those as being bold italic and bold italic. Now, the important thing in my style sheet, if I look at my stylesheet1.css, this is how you can reference fonts which you've downloaded from a web server or that you want to access directly from a commercial web server. What you do is you define something called a font face. You give it a name. So the font family, you can choose any name you want to. This is like a local variable, if you like, that represents the font in your application. And then you give it a source attribute. And the source attribute can contain any number of URLs that point to the fonts on your system or on some external server. They will be checked in sequence, and the browser will use whichever font format it supports. So ideally, it'll attempt to use the WOF file, which has been downloaded from the WOF fonts folder on my machine. If my browser doesn't support WOF files, then it'll use TTF files. And if it doesn't support TTF, then maybe it supports OTF. And if it doesn't support OTF, then hopefully it supports EOT. So what we've done here is we've set up a font face, we've given it a local name, and it'll be picking up the font information in one of those 4 files, depending on the browser's capabilities. In order to use this font in your application, I've got another style sheet here. The body will use as its font family. Now this is the way you'd normally set up a font in your application. You say font family, and then you give it the list of fonts. Under normal circumstances, you might specify something like Arial, or Verdana, or Times New Roman. What you do instead is you specify the name of the font that you defined up here. So the body will try to use this, in other words, one of these files, as the font. Obviously, if that's not available, then you can provide backups. So here, I could have listed Arial, or Lucida, or whatever. I could have specified sans serif as my backup font here. Okay, so what this means then is it'll pick up one of these fonts, and it'll apply it for the body. You'll also notice I've got some rules set up here. so that the first paragraph, which was normal class, that's this one, won't have any particular styles attached. And then the second one should be displayed in bold, but if you remember what the page actually looked like in the browser, this isn't actually bold. That seems to be just regular text. And likewise, if I go back into the editor, for the document, we have here the third paragraph that should have been in italic. So the italic class means display the font style in italics, but the third paragraph isn't in italics. And the reason for this is because in my style sheet, go back into the editor, all my style sheet does at the moment is to say, well, this is the regular font, if you like. It isn't capable of automatically displaying itself in bold or italic or bold italic. If you want that behavior, then you have to link in 4 separate fonts potentially. One font for normal, one font for bold, one for italic, and one for bold italic. And if you remember, in my folder, we did have 4 different versions of the font. A normal version, a bold version, bold italic, and just italic. These are the standard formats supported in WAF. So what you need to do in your style sheet is to set up 4 different font faces, referencing each of those 4 separate font files. And I've done that in the second version of the style sheet here, my stylesheet2.css. So let me take you through this. This first font face is the same as we've just seen. It sets up for regular usage, in other words, not bold or italic. It'll say, here's a font called my font. And in regular circumstances, that's the name of the file to pick up one of those 4 files in the appropriate folder. What you then do is you have another font face. This font face is similar to the one before, but it has a font weight. So you give it the same name because it's the same font really, just another part of the font if you like. But under bold classing, then it'll pick up this version of the file. Okay, so any text that's displayed in bold, that will be picking up this version of the font file, as opposed to the normal version of the font file. And then likewise, the third font face here, again, it's called my font because it's the same logical font really. But it says, well, if you want to display it in italics, then use this file. Use the italic version of the font file. So we have these 4 different files, and it'll pick up the appropriate one based on whether it needs to display in italics or bold, or potentially in bold italics. So if I skim down to the styles down below, so the body is going to be displaying using the my font. So that's been inherited by this element down here. But this one here wants to display in bold, so it'll automatically be intelligent enough to realize that when displaying in bold for that font name, it should pick up this font. Okay, so we have enough intelligence now, so it'll pick up the bold or the italic or the bold italic version of the font. All I need to do is to go into my document and change the style sheet rule to use my stylesheet2.css. I'll just save that file. And if I go back into Chrome and F5 to refresh, now you can see it's worked. The first paragraph is normal text. That picks up the first version of the font. The second paragraph is bold. So that picked up the second version of the font, the bold version. Then we had the italic font being picked up. And then finally, the bold italic font being picked up. So that concludes the lesson. We've seen the idea of WAF files. We've created WAF files here in a folder. And then we've seen how in your style sheets, you can define a font face, like so. Choose a name for your font family locally, like so. And then specify the name of the font file, plus backups if necessary, to use in that situation.